Okay, dear friends, also on behalf of the European Association of Public-Private Partnership, thank you very much for your attendance in today's meeting. As you maybe already know, the European Association of Public-Private Partnership is an association with members in different countries of the world. Raquel is one of them, interested in deepening the partnerships issues. This year, the subject we have chosen for our research activity is the relationship between public-private partnership and sustainable development. So today, special thanks go to Francesco, Diana, Paola, and Ilaria for sharing their research experience with us. Thank you, guys. I've met them as students in my course of Public-Private Partnership for Sustainable Development at the University of Milan, and I was really impressed with their research on the topic of national parks concession in Africa. So, as you will hear in a moment, the case they studied showed us that the synergies between local communities, public authorities, and the needs of the territory allows to obtain important results, both in terms of conservation of the natural environment and for social development, with job opportunities and new perspective for all. So now, in a broader approach, nowadays in Europe, PPPs definitely offer a great opportunity for implement the EU Recovery Fund. I mean, now, in the European context, public and private partnership is expected to be a relevant tool for generating public value. With PPPs, the public authorities could indeed benefit from entrepreneurial projects bringing added value. I think that becoming aware of what has been done elsewhere helps us to have new ideas. So I therefore leave the floor to the group of students that will illustrate the case of park concessions in Africa. Thank you really, guys. I'm sure you will be more brilliant than I. So thank you. Edu, I think you can allow them to share the screen or something.
I should be able to do that.
Okay.
Francesco, I think you are the first one, right?
You will lead?
Yes.
Francesco is going
I'm sharing the presentation. Can you see that?
Yes, thank you.
Perfectly.
Perfect. So I'm making it bigger. Okay. So sorry. So as you can, thank you. First, thank you all for being here, for spending some time with us, listening to us and our presentation. And thank you to Professor Valaguzza and Research Fellow Eduardo Parisi. So as you can see from the title, Public-Private Partnership Projects in the context of national parks in Africa, with a specific focus on South Africa, we wanted, as students of the LL.M in Sustainable Development, integrate the idea of sustainable development into the concept of public-private partnerships. So our idea was to find a way for PPPs to attain, or try to do so, to attain sustainable development. So public authorities, while performing their institutional functions, may suffer from different issues, and especially in developing countries, that is our focus, mismanagement, lack of resources, limited fundings are just some of the problems that may hinder the development of a country, and in specific cases, the sustainable development of that country. So as we know, sustainable development consists of three components: the economic aspect, the social, and environmental ones. So we try to see how the private operators can take on more responsibilities, more tasks, and even risks, and thus playing a greater role in the achievement of sustainable development within the framework of PPPs. So what are these contributions of PPPs to sustainable development? As to the economic pillar, a good management of national parks by private operator can become a source of attraction for external investments. May them be capital investments, labor investments, knowledge and infrastructures, funds, any kind of investments. By the way of these investments, the park can become more and more independent from an economic point of view, from public subsidies and public spending review in general. This reduced dependence by the national parks to the dependence on public subsidies can also allow the park no longer to be dependent on public budget constraints, public budget cuts that too often take place in developing countries where economic resources may be already very lacking. When we move to the social pillar, that is very, very important in developing countries, and in our South African experience, we are going to see how relevant this aspect is. Many contracts can or even must include local communities, those living in the neighborhood of the protected areas of the national parks. By involving them in all the process, from the negotiation into the signing of the contract and then implementation and monitoring thereof, we can also achieve the effect of mitigating the protest of the local communities because their needs, concerns, and priorities can be heard, voiced, and taken into considerations when signing the contract and then implementing it by the private operator. More and more visitors, tourists, and investments may allow for more job opportunities and employment in general for the members of these local communities. And higher employment means also more income opportunities for them, thus in one word, being more empowered to afford for better living standards. So for example, food, water, sanitation, electrification, infrastructure in general. When then we move to the environmental aspect, we know that national parks institutional function is environmental protection. So their aim is inherently bound to environmental protection, biodiversity conservation, and so on and so forth. PPP contracts and projects may reinforce this aspect by way of different projects. For example, anti-poaching projects, and we are going to see it in South Africa, for example, but also education projects that raise awareness about the importance of the environment and biodiversity in general. There are also indirect ways of taking into account the environmental protection. And one of these elements is the performance-based payments. That is to say, binding the payment of the private performances and services also on the basis of some requirement. For example, environmental requirements, such as a given number of endangered species must be protected and living in a certain area for a certain period of time, or a given area must be covered by specific kind of trees or plants that are endangered. So this is another way to think about environmental protection through the lens of PPPs and the contract provisions. This seems all very beautiful, even perfect, but of course, when you go to the practice, into the field, we can find some issues that may arise. First of all, the governing legislation. So is there a possibility for the private and for the public also to sign a contract, implement a contract based on a public-private partnership for the management of national parks? We are going to see it in a minute with our colleague Diana. But there are also some other general issues that can be also found in our focus in South Africa. Conflicting interests. So we know that the contract is the result of a compromise between a private lucrative perspective from one side and the public good its pursuit from the public authorities. So a balance must be achieved, not only in the interest, but also in terms of community inclusion, as we can see here, the third bullet point. Sometimes is a possibility Other times it is even a requirement, but the private can sometimes ignore this requirement, and so the inclusion of the community can be hindered or hampered in general. As to the demand risk and payment mechanism, sometimes the private operator cannot be attracted by some kind of payment mechanisms, such as the one I've just explained, the performance-based mechanism, because investors and the private want predictability of success and of profits. So also here a compromise must be achieved between the parties. And finally, in our context of developing countries, political instability is another issue that may not attract many visitors, tourists, and hinder the development of the country in general and sustainable development in specific. So now I will leave the floor to Diana, who will talk about the legislation, the regulatory framework in South Africa about the PPPs. So thank you very much, and Diana, is your turn.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm gonna mainly talk about the national legislation in South Africa regarding PPP, and there are three main aspects. So it's the Treasury Regulation 16, National Treasury PPP Manual or Framework, and the Standardized PPP Provisions of 2004. This is all for national PPPs. When we talk about local PPPs, they have a different kind of regulations, but we're gonna stay in the national sphere. So what does PPP, or how is it understood in the framework? So of course, it's understood as a commercial transaction between an institution and a private party, where the private performs an institutional function or acquires the use of state property for its own commercial purposes, and receives a benefit either by the way of being paid by the institution, by charges or fee collected by the private party, or a combination of the two. Within the framework, we find a whole process of how to achieve a PPP. So the stages in a PPP according to the national framework, which of course we have the inception, the feasibility study, procurement, and management. So the first process or the first step is inception. Here, the public institution has to identify the project with an initial analysis based on the needs and the options, concluding initially that the PPP is the best option. After that, they have to account an accounting officer or authority that it's the only one that is going to be able to enter into a PPP agreement on behalf of the public institution, and as such has to register the PPP with the relevant treasury. As we will see throughout the whole process, the relevant treasury is going to be of extreme importance, given that without their go-to or their green light, they cannot go from one phase to another. The treasury always has to accept it. Then we have to go to the feasibility study. Here we have three main stages. One, the scope. So again, we have to demonstrate as a public institution that the project aligns with the institution's strategic objective, that we have the available budget if there is one needed, what are going to be the outputs of said project, and the scope of it. Stage two is due diligence. Legal, economic, technical due diligence. In terms of legal issues, the main problems here are use rights and regulatory matters, and something that is very iconic and very special about PPPs in South Africa, that is Black economic empowerment. Why? Because Black economic empowerment, or BEE, is going to be transversal to the whole project. So here in the stage two, during the feasibility study, we have to identify project-specific BEE conditions, Black enterprise strength, and any constraining factors that is going to impede the achievement of the BBB output. Here, this work is crucial to ensure that we have a BBB outcome that is according to our PPP, because it will impact also the project's affordability and value for money, and the willingness of the private to assume the risk. And in stage 3, we find what we normally find in every PPP in value assessment. So affordability, value for money, and risk transfer. Affordability, of course, the financial commitment, if any, by the institution, and that they can be met by funds, by public funds. Here it's very important because we have to remember that affordability is the driving constraint. So even if in the value for money, which is that the provision determines a net benefit in terms of cost, price, quantity, quality, or a combination of those. But if we have value for money, but we don't have affordability, there is not a possibility to gain that PPP. And finally, risk transfer. So of course, we have to analyze the risk, recognize the risk. And once we find those risks, it has to be met with what should be their allocation. What are the strategies to mitigate those risks, and who's gonna be left with those risks? Sometimes for the institution, it's better to maintain certain risks. After we've done all those 3 stages, we have to go again under treasury approval and move to procurement. In procurement, we have, as I said in the first part, we have a standardized PPP provision from the National Treasury, and these provisions are mainly intended for certain type of projects. Nonetheless, in the standardized provisions, it is determined when an institution can move out from those provisions. But even if the project does not meet every provision or every framework established within, most of the procurement documents have to meet as far as possible or as much as possible with all of these provisions. Now we go to the stages. So of course we have a request for qualification where we have to limit the number of eligible private parties. We select a number of consortia that are qualified technically, financially, and also in terms of BEE. And only these pre-qualified bidders can go on into the next step, that is the request for proposal, RFP. Here we have a bidder participation in preparing the final documents, and after the feedbacks, we have to go to the relevant treasury with the final documents that have to be final RFP documentation and a draft PPP agreement to obtain the treasury approval. Once we have the treasury approval, we can begin the bidding process. And here, most importantly, is that there are 3 core elements of the BEE that has to be taken into consideration. So 1, direct empowerment through ownership and control of enterprises and assets, human resource development and employment equity, and finally, indirect empowerment through preferential procurement and enterprise development. All of these 3 BEE elements have to compose no less than 50% and no more of 20% of the components within the bidding evaluation. This proportion was made in order not to compromise the financial and technical components, but still have a very large inclusion of Black economic empowerment. Finally, so once we have the bidding process, we've secured the bid winner, we can go to the management of the PPP agreements. This is the final stage, of course, and here we find an accounting officer that is the responsible of making sure that this PPP agreement is properly implemented, managed, and enforced. Here we have 3 main issues, so partnership agreement management, service delivery management, and PPP agreement administration. The first one, the partnership management, has to do with the accountability and how the institution and the private party are going to relate to each other. So for example, corporate governance, relationship assessment, or very important, dispute resolutions. There are several steps before you can take a PPP agreement to court. Service delivery management, which is mainly the systems and procedures to manage risk and the performance. So we have to remember risk, there are going to be more risk, or there may be more risk or change of risk, and this has to be met with an appropriate action. And finally, PPP agreement administration, that has mainly to do with the amendment and variation of the PPP agreement. So given that the PPP is a change from public procurement, most amendments, if they're big enough, have to follow the same cycle the PPP began with. And this is the final step. So I'm going to leave now with so she can talk to you more about the specific PPP we're talking about.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks everybody for being here. After this detailed analysis of the legal system, is now time to see who are the main actors of such PPPs agreement. SANParks, or South African National Parks, is the national authority in charge of managing national parks and protected areas within South Africa. It was established firstly in 1926, but fully revised in 2003 in order to embed the BEE Diana was mentioning before within its strategy. The main goals such organization is aimed to achieve are the promotion of and conservation of natural and cultural heritage, both through projects within the parks and also outside by involving the local communities and raising awareness of the beauties of South African state. Then we have poverty alleviation, and Paula will mainly tackle this point later on, but the many projects related to training, trainership, and works have been implemented, especially tackling the issue involving national surrounding communities. And finally, we have research with an extensive focus on biodiversity and nature loss. But how National Parks is able to reach such goals? Through its commercialization strategy. It was implemented in 2000 after the authority, SANParks, started to have some lack of funds. It was previously, as Francesco mentioned, subsidized by the state, and therefore was bound to ask and look for different sources of revenues and incomes. Therefore, it started to externalize very specific services, for example, related to food provision within parks to private entities and local partners that had a relevance on the ground. At the time, very specific and limited services were provided by private partners, while during the year, many more services have been enhanced and privatized. Right now, the 80% of SANParks revenues are coming from public and private partnerships, and the remaining 20% is related to directly payments by private providers mainly, which is the authority in charge of this commercialization strategy is the Business Development Unit that directly manages at this time more than 50 PPPs around South African parks. The main idea of the commercialization strategy since the beginning have been both a monetary value and a strategic value. Monetary value in answering somehow the issue related to funds, and we can say that in this aspect the commercialization strategy has been successful. In fact, just in 2019, the revenues provided were equal to 157 million rand, more than 1,000 million rand since the beginning of the enhancement of such strategy. But also a strategic value in order to provide and to enter new segments of the markets that were not covered previously by the service of the authority itself. Especially high-level experience in relation to tourism have been strongly and positively enhanced and impacted by the establishment of luxury, we can say, collaboration with private entities. A specific point I would like to focus now has been the impact of such strategy and overall of public and private partnership on tourism. Tourism is not just a key element in the South African economy, is what have been conceived by the state as one of the main boosters of its growth. It was able in the last 2 years to provide more entrance to the national GDP than the second most labor-intensive economy and sector within the country. Therefore, a specific focus has been put on tourism, and especially in the relation between PPPs and tourism, in order to fully benefit from such area of the economy. St. Park has, since 2011, therefore, introduced a strategic adaptive management strategy, especially for tourism, based on the idea to involve a huge number of different stakeholders with the aim of creating and establishing a clear and pointed responsible tourism policy. The idea was to involve people coming from very different backgrounds and expertise, both researchers but also academics, tourism manager at local level, so within the parks themselves, but also national authorities, to put together all the different views and perspective in order to implement a policy fully able to embed both economic goal, so able to sustain economic growth of South Africa, but also to support and sustain the principle of sustainable development, with a special focus on biodiversity, as we mentioned before, but also social inclusion of local communities. This strategy is divided in 3 main phases. The first one is adaptive planning, through the engagement, as I was mentioning before, of very different stakeholders, both at a local and a national level. And the first stage of such strategy was put in practice in February 2011 to the establishment of a workshop oriented to start defining a broad idea of strategy focusing on biodiversity and inclusion. The second step is divided in two main points. The first one was the identification of the state of art, and therefore a simulative game, we can say, in order to imagine how to close such gaps, how to close such lacunes within the already in place tourism strategy in South Africa. And then a socio-ecological diagram was put in practice in order to involve all those external stakeholders that were more complex to involve since the beginning. For example, the leaders of the local communities surrounding each specific primary park. And finally, there was adaptive evaluation that was based on the establishment of key KPIs in order to monitoring the actual achievement of goals and objectives, both in the short and medium term. Despite the very successful strategy put in practice, many challenges appeared during the implementative phase. And in fact, despite the innovability and innovation of such project, which overall was considered successful by the authority, especially by the tourist authority at a national level, many, let's say, shortcomings appeared during the years. The first one was related to the necessity to align different time frames and objectives, since, for example, tourism manager have normally a very short-term perspective, while researchers or St. Parks were oriented both to long-term sustainability implementation. A second point was the difficulties in aligning the legal structure and therefore the auditing requirements to the managerial or operative structure, and therefore all the actions that were effectively implemented. And finally, capacity constraints and we can say difficulties in aligning all the different perspectives on the reaching of shared goals. And therefore, we can say that overall, the attempt to add a specific tourism focus within SAM, Strategic Adaptive Management in South Africa, was considered a success, but with very different very different rates of positivity somehow. And for this reason, it has been started 2 years ago, a procedure of revision that is already in place, that is still in place, sorry, and we will see which will be the result in the next 6 months, 1 year, I would say. And with that, I will leave the floor to Paola with the final part of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria, and good afternoon to everybody. So when talking about PPP, it's important to understand why the parties decide to undertake this type of contract. On one side, we know that we have the public actor, whose main interests are sharing the risk with the private actor. These can be of different natures, such as construction risk, management risks, and so on. But also an increase of tourism that can contribute to the employment rates. In fact, sandparks have contributed to the national agenda of job creation, poverty alleviation, as we already mentioned, and also uplifting of marginalized citizens. Also, PPP has allowed the neighboring populations to live in close to the parks to get involved. As a matter of fact, historically, the national park excluded the majority of South African people in the activity of the parks. And in order to overcome this, the sandparks has managed to formulate a socioeconomic development strategy that allowed to assist the development of communities living close by to the parks. Another very important interest of the public actor is the empowerment of community. PPP has helped the public actor to encourage local but also international businesses to see what else South Africa has to offer. And this has been possible thanks to the increase of international tourist numbers, thanks to the 5-star facility, for example, also the more retail and restaurant infrastructure, but also bringing in private capital and expertise to improve sandparks' tourism products. And as we already briefly mentioned, PPP, the PPP in sandparks has really put on a fight against the poaching and wildlife crime in general. On the other hand, we have the private actor. The private actor, what does he gain? What are the interests in undertaking a PPP contract? We have temporary access to the public property to conduct his own business. We have an income and economic interest. So the private will always look at a lucrative perspective, but he also look at a contribution to people's life. And for example, this has been possible by supporting the communities through a donation of wildlife. Some of the main impacts on the cooperation between the private and the public actors in sandpark have been, for example, the project Ivory at Kruger Park. And the aim of this project was to mobilize resources to support the campaign against poaching of elephant and other species. Or also the educational activities, such as Kids in Parks program that's allowed to kids and teachers to visit the national parks and to learn about the cultural heritage. Another fundamental element, though, that we have to take into account is the public inclusion's interest. The goal of the public participation process is to work directly with the stakeholders, making sure that the concerns and aspirations are consistently understood and taken into consideration. So therefore, a strong dialogue is simply essential. While analyzing sandpark case, we actually came across a quite similar case called USFS, so United States Forest Service. The American park system, just like the South African one, was needing a new approach to ensure operational and managerial stability. The project is called the Whole Park PPP, and actually over half of the USFS national parks are under the private actor management. And this has been taking place, for example, in Colorado, California, or Washington. Even in this case, the public and the private actors have similar interests compared to our example in South Africa. For example, as the public has the ownership of the park, it has to deal with policy decision, fees, or planning. And these have been taken off then the private's shoulder. On the other hand, the private is responsible for a day-to-day operation and maintenance, including all the related costs. And so therefore the key for the private actor is to lower the operating costs, and this could be possible by having a more efficient staffing model. In this case, it's always something that the public actors have struggled with by hiring for the parks staff on the long-term contracts that required additional higher costs instead of just having seasonal ones. The government, in both cases, has also the possibility to set quality and maintenance standards at its own discretion, and so hold the private company accountable to meet them through a performance-based PPP contract. Together with the interest, we also have to outline some of the major issues when undertaking a PPP. As we already mentioned, a balance of interest. So national parks are a common good that can suffer of too much visitation. And we know the park is kept at its best when it's pristine. But the private operator also needs to have an adequate volume of visitors to make profit. So it's a very difficult balance to achieve. So it's important that the government sets out clear regulation and also guidelines to ensure that the park is maintained protected while ensuring a worthy return for the operator. A second issue is the community inclusion. Many projects in the past have faced at least initial opposition, mainly based on the fears that the commercial interest of the operator will alter the site's appeal. So as I said before, it's important to address the community concerns and to have an open dialogue that can alleviate public mistrust, but it's also crucial to avoid any type of protest or general dissatisfaction. A third issue would be the demand risk and structuring the payment mechanism. So the authority can allow the operator to maintain and operate a variety of services in exchange of for a performance-based availability payment. The authorities could tie the operator's payment to the level of visitors to the public park in order to incentivize the operator to perform any promotion-related obligation. So the demand risk associated with a visitor-based payment mechanism is linked to the first issue mentioned before. Although lenders are likely to finance a project if their repayments are always subject to the ups and downs of tourism. So the key is to permit the operator to have a stable income and make most projects financeable, while at the same time ensuring that operator is motivated to maximize the number of visitors to the park. Force majeure is another very crucial issue when talking about PPP. Some of these can be political instabilities, decline of visitors, or in our case, for example, a pandemic. The lack of political stability, for example, and respect for the rule of law are major constraints that drive visitors away. But also the local economic condition, the uncertainties, or also the rising cost of living are very potential factors that could lead to a reduction of visitors in the South African parks. But anyway, when a party is affected by any event of force majeure, it must take all the means to mitigate the consequences of this event and ensure that its performance obligations are met, and it has to use all the reasonable efforts to remedy to its failures. Last but not least, the non-compliance of the lessee. So in case of non-compliance, the agreements require that if the lessee fails to perform its obligations and responsibility in accordance with the PPP agreement, and those are not remedied within 14 days, the Sun Park is entitled to remedy such failure and to protect its rights and interests at expenses of the lessee, which then has to make a payment towards Sun Park for the costs or expenses or all the damages caused. Thank you very much, and I leave the floor to Francesco for the final conclusions.
Thank you, Paola. So we try to draw some conclusions about our presentation, our project, that we will leave open for further discussions, also for our debate. But in any case, the first one is that in South Africa, we can find a very strong and regulated legal framework for PPPs and implementation of such contracts. This allows for predictability, transparency, and clearness. But we also point out the need for more flexibility for softer PPPs. So it's good to have a strong legal framework for some context, but for softer PPPs, maybe flexibility could be a more useful tool to have success. As to the three main components of sustainable development, we have seen it from the South African experience that first, as to the economic pillar, PPPs can give in the field of national parks real economic benefits, not only for the private operator, but also for the public administration in general. Tourism has become, thanks to the increase of public-private partnerships, has become a driver for development, and I would say also sustainable development in the country, which also made it possible for South Africa to become a more economically stable and compete internationally and not only regionally. As to the social part, we've seen that Black economic empowerment is even a requirement for the successful signing and implementation of the contract. So this means that it's not only a possibility, but it's a requirement that private parties have to comply with. And finally, as to the environmental protection side, thanks to a very good management of national parks in South Africa and better services provided by the private operators in terms of biodiversity conservation and wildlife protection, also by way of different projects, maybe them environmental or anti-poaching ones. In general, we can say that environmental protection has benefited a lot from this kind of projects and partnerships between the public and the private. So in one word, we can say that PPPs are a very effective and strong legal tool in the attainment of sustainable development. So this is the end. Thank you for your attention, and we are available here to any kind of questions if you have any. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, guys. Really, thank you. I think that you were really able to simplify a complex framework, and thank you for this. And then even you were able to demonstrate what's the meaning of sustainable development out of only greening, but joining social issues in multilateral systems in which society and entrepreneurship and public authority come together and do something useful for the community that is interested by some PPPs. So really, thank you so much. Yes, I open the session for Q&A or for any comments you have. You can work freely.
I have one question.
Please go, Esther. Thank you for.
Thank you so much for the presentation to all of you. I was following the conclusion that you have said that it's important to have strong legal framework from one side, and from another side, it's also important to have flexibility. So I was thinking about, so what is the best model of what could be the PPP law? PPP law should be a binding law, or PPP law should be a soft law? This is really important because when the public have to work with the private, we tend to identify PPP as a corporations, but if there is no binding, the private cannot pay. For sustainability, we need the private to pay for something, to participate in paying the cost. So so in that, I want to, what is your opinion on what could be the best model of law? We should have soft law or binding law? Thank you. I don't know if it's clear.
Yes, it is. Diane, I think it's for you.
Yes, so I was gonna try to answer. First of all, thank you so much for your question, and we hope you liked our presentation. What we wanted to go to with that conclusion was mainly that PPP framework regulation in South Africa, it's mainly directed, once I went very quickly through the regulation, but it's mainly directed to very big PPPs. So construction PPPs, infrastructure PPPs that have a very big financial component within it. So even though we did explain the national parks example, it's still a very complex PPP that was able to be subdued within the framework, but other more simple PPPs, for example, social PPPs, would have a harder time to be subdued within that framework, mainly because it gives a lot of emphasis to the financial aspect. But between having mandatory PPP, a mandatory framework or a soft law framework, I do believe it's important to have a mandatory framework. One of the reasons being what you just said, the importance of having the private gain some responsibility within the project. But it should also have a level of flexibility, especially for those smaller PPPs that are not able to have maybe the personnel or the importance to meet all of the requirements. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And if I may, this is something that also come up with during our classes with Professor Valaguzza. And we said that, and I agree with that, and also with what Diana just said. From one side, rigidity in terms of legal rigidity is fine for, as Diana said, big PPPs projects that involves very significant, I would say, financial benefits and spillovers in the negative point of view. But I would say that a possibility for those kind of softer, as we said, softer PPPs or smaller PPPs is what we can say as called as best practices. So the idea was to see what can be done by private operators in small PPPs, so leaving them more freedom to act in practice, and then see if these practices are good and really flexible for the private operator, so give some good outcomes for both parties involved in the project or the contract, making them more binding, but still the rigidity that the big PPPs must to comply with, I think can be not very good for developing PPPs on a broader side. So for smaller PPPs or for social, as Diana said, or only environmental ones. So I would say in brief that from one side we have binding norms, very rigid ones, and from the other flexible best practices that must deal with different projects. So the former with big ones, and the latter for the smaller one, or those involving smaller private operators. But of course, it's just an opinion and a proposal. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But how to ensure the balance of because you have mentioned in the beginning that sustainable development has the economic, the social, and environment. So I'm thinking about how to make this balance with the kind of with the small projects. When you support that for small project, there should be some kind of flexibility. So how to ensure that? Because also in practice, the public also sometimes do not respect rules. You know, what do you think?
I mean, it's difficult because I of course I don't have an answer, and the idea may be to The idea would be, in my view, since we also study other subject matters in the course, is the facilitation of compliance with some requirements. So, as in international law and sustainable development, trying to facilitate the compliance of the public and also the private to comply with the provisions of a contract or best practices in case of flexible PPPs, instead of always imposing requirements to comply with and punish the non-compliance with that. Because I think that in this way, if we are too rigid, we couldn't spread this legal instrument, the PPP, in an effective way. Then, of course, it is difficult to balance all the three components. So we chose national parks because we thought that it was a good example that integrate all the three aspects. But there are many PPPs that focus only on one, on that, only on social or only on environment. So in that case, I think it's easier to look only for flexible requirements. When we go to an attempt to merge all these three components, it's more difficult, and maybe rigidity can be better than flexibility, because otherwise, for example, just to give an example, the private will focus only on the economic and overlooking all the other aspects. So I think that according to the project, the contract we are looking at, different kind of approaches should be taken.
I personally fully agree with Francesco in the necessity to apply a case-by-case, let's say, perspectives. In relation to tourism, for example, one of the main issue for the local tourism managers, therefore those practically living and managing parks, was the necessity and the requirement to comply with auditing and reporting. And one of the main issue was that standards were normally, in the majority of the cases, set for bigger, set while thinking to bigger parks, for example, the Kruger Park. While for protected areas of a smaller dimension, many issue in case of finding the data and finding reliable data were actually experienced by the managers. Therefore, in the second stage, those of evaluation, their opinion was fully taken into consideration, and their local perspective was presented in the review, in one of the main steps of the process of review, in order to see if there were other ideas, other way to emphasize the positive transition towards the respect of reporting requirements, despite the inability in some cases to be fully compliant since the beginning. So this way of transitioning towards standard somehow.
Thank you, guys. Father?
Yes, I take the opportunity to ask a question also related to what Ilaria just said. Because you were mentioning in the presentation that one of the issue is related to community inclusion. And I was wondering if you happen to come across some recommendations or best practices on how to solve conflicts with communities, and in case, at what stages communities can be included so that their interests are fully taken into account.
I think this is more a question on what I was talking about. So community can be included in many fields when talking about sand parks. One of the main example that we saw was including them in bringing them into the parks and be aware of the biodiversity, the heritage, but also bringing them into working in the parks. And this, as I said before, has had a massive impact on the empowerment, the employment rates, because bringing the local communities into the park has increased the numbers of workers that were living close by to the parks. And I didn't come across a specific project when researching on the Sand Park, but I'm sure there will be some specific projects that focus on the communities around the parks to be involved.
I came across an example while focusing actually on not a transversal, we can say, a topic that was political representation. And an example was the establishment of a trust made by the community leaders of the 8 groups living around the Addo Elephant Park. And since the prior difficulties was for them to have a common idea, a common perspective, a common advocacy request. Somehow, the process was for them to establish a dialogue, while, let's say, just among them, without involving the authorities. And in a second moment, after establishing the trust and the priority of the trust, they presented themselves as a group. And therefore, somehow their voices were heard stronger and in a more clear position and perspective. But that was a single case, and unfortunately, I don't think we found anything more specific about it.
Thank you, Daria. Thank you, Paola.
I had found another example, but of course it's a general example. I didn't find specific experiences in South Africa or in Africa in general or in other countries, and was something that happened before. So not only including people into the park and its management, but involving the community in the process of granting a concession. This to say, the public authority granted a concession to the community who lived in the neighborhood of the national area, the national park. And this is good in cases where there are not too many communities and not too harsh conflicts between them. So the public authority granted the concession to the community, and then the community granted the sub-concession to the private operator. And then in the end, the private operator had to pay a fee, not only to the public, but also to the community who had granted the sub-concession to the private. So with this fee, with this money, the community then could improve the services around the area or the infrastructure. But this is, of course, a general example. I hadn't found a specific experience in a specific context, but this was another possible solution, I would say.
Thank you, guys. I think it's time to come to Eduardo with some final remarks, I think.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you to Francesco, Diana, Paola, Ilaria for their presentations and their availability to answer to questions and their capacity to answer to open questions. So thanks a lot. I think that what we discussed today is a problem that is both global and local. Global because there are interests involved that directly affect the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. And this is demonstrated also by the participation of some international organizations that also drafted some guidelines, Eleonora, such as the UNEP and UNESCO in their action of organizing and maintaining national treasures and reserves. So they drafted operational manuals and guidelines. And this is interesting also because it is one of the sectors in which these guidelines have not been drafted by financial institutions or the World Bank, but by organizations that are devoted to the protection of public interests. Speaking of public interest or common interest, since we're talking about a public-private partnership, I think that today I wrote down many common interests that have been discussed, meaning problems of governance that come directly and that spurs directly from the community and that are managed by the community itself, along with the public authorities. And these are protection of biodiversity and ecosystems, the rational use of natural resources, the conservation of cultural heritage, the valorization of the cultural scenario embedded in the habitat. Ilaria talked about poverty alleviation and the positive effects in the surrounding local communities that these projects have, the promotion of tourism, but also it was mentioned, I think, by Ilaria, the promotion of education and scientific research, which is also very interesting. But more broadly, I would say that this demonstrates the tendency and the need to establish a more balanced relationship between society and local communities and the nature within the protection of habitats that take care not only of the natural and animal components of the habitat, but also of the social part. And Francesco, I think that clearly expressed what the problems are of only public entrustment of the dealing with these problematics, such as the lack of public resources, or as he said, the mismanagement of public resources, the lack of personnel, but also I would add also the problem of the image to the public administration that may derive from poor services that are offered to the community, and also a need to protect sensitive areas from the interests of corporations that may be interested in developing and exploiting natural resources and also social knowledge of the communities that are living in the area. I think that the key here, what was referred to as the compromise, can be found in a sustainable tourism. The touristical value is what brings forward the compromise between the public and the private. And I think that, as it was referred, even by Diana, not every tourism is equal is always the same. Tourism must be governed, and in this respect, it was interesting to find that even the UN in 2012, in a resolution of 2012 of the UN General Assembly, referred to a concept and introduced a concept that I think is very useful for this kind of public-private partnership, which is ecotourism. So what should be promoted is ecotourism, which imposes on local residents and companies to take care in a more human perspective and nature-based perspective of tourism, because otherwise the risk is, of course, to leave this only in the hands of the revenues that may come from participation of the public. So this is something that requires not only, as Diana was saying, a value for money approach, but I think something that goes further, and I think that you guys expressed it very well, which is an interest toward the public sector that puts the context at first, and the methods and the solutions that you proposed and that you mentioned, such as a performance-based payment or more creative payments that that underlines the importance and the connection of the performance by the private party with the achievement of social interest. I think that is pivotal here. I just want to conclude by saying that even the case-by-case approach that Esther brought up with their question is pivotal here. In a very recent publication on public-private partnership by Timothy Nylander, the author used the concept of autopoiesis, meaning the capacity of an organism to produce itself norms and law by letting their components interact in a free way, so that each system should focus on their components and find a way and how to find a way to let them speak and produce value. So this is how I would like to conclude, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you, Edu. Really, thank you so much for your reflection. Thank you all. We will keep you updated with upcoming seminar with the European Association of Public-Private Partnership. Have a good lunch. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Great students.